This is what evil looks like. Israel Keyes took as many as 11 lives, treating crime like a vacation activity. From his home base in Anchorage, Alaska, where he lived with his family, this Army veteran would plan homicidal excursions across the country, first flying to another state, then driving huge distances in a rental car to obscure his location, and funding these trips with bank robberies. He had kits stashed around the country with everything he needed to commit his heinous acts, and his preferred method was to choke his victims with his bare hands because he enjoyed watching them fade away. His crimes might have gone unsolved if he had maintained his strict discipline, but in 2012 he kidnapped 18-year-old Samantha Keyes from a coffee shop in Anchorage. He then took pictures of her body posed to look alive so he could extort money from her family. Police tracked the withdrawals made from her account to several states and determined they were made by someone driving a white Ford Focus, and he was soon arrested. After months of playing games with investigators, he would eventually use a razor blade to end his own life, leaving more questions than answers. Howdy, welcome back to Monster Watch. We got a creepy one this time around. Israel Keyes, who idolized Ted Bundy and traveled across the country taking lives. There's a lot of unanswered questions in this case, so I kept it straight to the facts, as always. Enjoy. What made Israel Keyes do what he did? Was he born with something evil inside him, or did something in his life lead him down a path of violence? While his childhood does seem to be full of neglect, and even a bit strange, it lacks the brutality of someone like Mary Bell. Keyes was born on January 7, 1978 in Richmond, Utah, the second child of Heidi and Jeff Keyes, who were religious fundamentalists. They would go on to have 10 children total, all of whom were homeschooled. When Israel Keyes was 5 years old, the family relocated to a remote piece of land outside Colville, Washington. They lived in a one-room cabin with no running water or electricity, though eventually some of the kids were forced to sleep in a tent outside when the shack ran out of room. To earn money for food and supplies, the family would work on nearby farms. They would also hunt their own meat. As Israel would later say, he hunted everything with a heartbeat. With the move, there was also a shift in their faith. They left the organization that they had been a part of and joined a new one, a church called the Ark. Keyes would say that the group was identity-oriented and militant. And he's not wrong, the SPLC has the Ark labeled as a hate group. Two of his childhood friends, Chevy and Shane Keogh, would go on to do some horrific things in the name of their racial identity, to get money to buy land to make a training camp for racially motivated militants. Keyes would brag to the other kids at church about skinning a deer alive and was generally unsettling from a young age, which led him to be isolated. As a result, he started to hang out with other kids who were on the edge, leading to various criminal activities including burglaries and then selling stolen weaponry he took from houses. The cruelty towards animals that he bragged about would continue as well. One event in particular stood out to Keyes during his interviews years later, where he used a .22 revolver to do something horrible to a cat in front of family friends. Israel said that he had laughed, but that the other kids had been upset, with one even vomiting. It was at this moment that he realized that he was different from other people. Because of this, he would further self-isolate to the point that his mother noticed that something was off with him. Meanwhile, Israel was becoming more independent and self-sustaining, finding work as a carpenter for contractors. He used these skills to help build a log cabin for his family at age 16. One of the first attacks that he confessed to against a person was an assault on a young woman along the Deschutes River in Oregon around 1997. He had been playing with the idea of Satanism and decided that he wanted to sacrifice someone. The girl had been riding an inner tube down the river with a group of friends. She was the last in the group, and like a predator picking off a straggler from the herd, Keyes dragged her out of the water and brought her to a secluded campsite where he did disgusting and evil things to her. He had planned to use a knife on the young woman as part of a twisted ritual, but when it came down to it, she was able to talk him out of it. In interviews with investigators, Keyes would say that he was just not violent enough yet, but resolved to not let future victims escape. Israel was deeply interested in studying infamous criminals like Dennis Rader and Robert Hansen. His particular favorite was Ted Bundy. Soon after the Deschutes River assault, the Keyes family moved to Smyrna, Maine to collect sap for maple syrup makers in a community dominated by a rejection of modernity that Keyes described as Amish-like. In 1998, Israel went to his family and told them that he was renouncing their faith. His family kicked him out of their dysfunctional household, and soon thereafter he went to New York and enlisted in the U.S. Army on July 9, 1998. He would spend 3 years in the military, reaching the rank of specialist. During this time, he would hone his already formidable survival skills, even taking part in a preliminary training program for the Army Rangers. Keyes would say that he had not taken any lives during his time in the Army, but he did assault 2 women, one in Egypt while he was stationed in Sinai and another in Israel. He drank heavily during this period of his life, as if he was fighting to drown out the impulses that he would later indulge. He would even admit to fellow soldiers that he would like to take a life just for fun. Otherwise, he is said to have been a bit of a loner, preferring to drink by himself rather than join in parties with other soldiers. Though he did meet a woman in 2000 that he would have a daughter with the following year. Years later, after he had been caught, his primary focus would be protecting his daughter from learning the truth about him and his crimes, which tells us that he did know the difference between right and wrong. Keyes' alcohol use would catch up with him in February of 2001 when he got a DUI. Perhaps this was a sign of his mental deterioration and increasing inability to restrain himself from doing what he really wanted to do. He left the Army only months later in July of that year and went to live with his child and the mother of his daughter. It is believed that Keyes' homicidal rampage began shortly after his discharge from the Army, but this is based on his own statements once he was arrested, and we do not know the specifics of many of these crimes. Israel would settle in Nia Bay, Washington, where he said he took the lives of several people, though he was vague with the details as he tried to bargain with investigators from his jail cell. Though he would say that there had been a couple and 3 individuals who he had targeted, and that he buried the couple near a valley and put the others in Crescent Lake. While living in Nia Bay, Keyes would work for the Maca Tribal Council and lived on the reservation. He would spend 6 years there until he broke up with his girlfriend and met someone new. In March of 2007, Keyes, his daughter, and his new girlfriend would drive to Anchorage, Alaska to start a new life together. Israel began his own construction company, putting the skills he had learned to use. But this also meant that he got to choose his own hours, allowing him to slip away on his special trips whenever he wanted. Some believe that Keyes was responsible for the Boca Raton mall attacks in 2007, though this seems very unlikely. The composite of the mall suspect bears only a slight resemblance to Israel and was described as a Hispanic male, making a connection fairly doubtful. There were many of his special cross-country trips, which often began with a flight to a different state. Then he would rent a car to travel long distances before he committed his crimes. One such trip occurred in October and November of 2008, where he flew to Washington, then used a car rental to traverse multiple states before returning to Alaska. Israel would take another of these trips in April of 2009, this time to the East Coast. On the 9th, he abducted a woman who he drove into upstate New York, where she was eventually buried. On the 10th, he would rob the community bank in Tupper Lake, New York, afterwards hiding in a campground waiting for the emergency vehicles that were searching for him to pass by. In July of 2010, Israel flew to Sacramento, California. Over the next 3 days, he would put nearly 300 miles on a rental car. The FBI believes there may have been crimes during this time and is looking for any information related to his activities. In April or May of 2011, Keyes showed signs that he was willing to be riskier with his crimes. Rather than his usual flight and drive, he positioned himself to look out over a park in Anchorage. He had intended to attack a young couple with a firearm, but a police officer arrived on the scene before he could fire. Still not deterred, Israel said that he simply planned on adding the cop to his list of targets that night. Luckily, a second police cruiser pulled in, which finally made Keyes give up his plan. In June of 2011, just a few months later, the creature boarded a plane to Chicago. From there, he drove to Essex, Vermont, where on June 8th he would take the lives of a husband and wife. On the way, he stopped in Burlington to retrieve a bucket that he had hidden a firearm, zip ties, duct tape, and Drano inside. The homicide of Bill and Lorraine Currier is one of only 3 which we have a direct confession for and an explanation of exactly what happened, though the bodies were never found. Keyes said that he approached the couple at home and smashed through a glass back door as they slept. Startled by the loud crash, Bill and Lorraine woke and almost immediately saw an armed stranger standing over them wearing a headlamp. They were both tied up, and then Israel says that he interrogated them, asking for the location of their valuables, making it seem like he was only there to rob them. Keyes loaded 2 suitcases with an assortment of clothing and any financial paperwork that he could find, then forced the couple into a car and drove them off to an abandoned farmhouse. As the sun started to rise, he shepherded the Curriers inside. Bill was brought in first, and while Keyes tied him to a chair, Lorraine nearly escaped but was chased down by the creature. He strapped her down to a bed upstairs. Once he could hear cars outside, Bill tried to resist, knowing that help was as close as the front door. In response, Israel flew into a rage and unloaded all 10 rounds of the 22 that he was carrying, then went upstairs to dispatch Lorraine. Before he did so, he violently assaulted her twice, but physical violence was not the only evil he inflicted on his victims. He forced Lorraine to go downstairs and look at what he had done to her husband. As she stared in horror, he crept up behind her and wrapped a rope around her neck. Keyes then doused the couple with Drano and stuffed them into plastic garbage bags. It is assumed that the bags were simply tossed in with the other garbage from the house. Though there was a massive search at the landfill that any garbage from that area would have been sent, the couriers were never found. By 2012, Keyes was once again ready to strike much closer to home. He began scouting out the drive-through coffee stands in Anchorage. He settled on common grounds because of its strategic location that would make it easier for the creature to escape unseen with his captive, and because it was open later than the others. On February 1st, 2012, Israel approached common grounds where Samantha Koenig was working the closing shift alone. It was just about time to shut down for the night, 8 p.m., and freezing cold, so the ski mask that Keyes wore was not suspicious. He had been watching the girl and knew that Koenig did not drive a car to work, and so there would be no abandoned vehicle to draw attention. Pulling out a weapon, Keyes demanded that Samantha turn off the lights to obscure what he was doing to passing motorists. He demanded that she hand over the money from the register, which she did, then forced his way inside and zip-tied her hands behind her back, and escorted her to his truck and drove off. He realized that she had left behind her phone, which he needed for the next part of his plan. Keyes returned to the coffee stand with Koenig still in his truck to grab her phone. Then, after locking her in a shed in his front yard, he also made a trip to her home to retrieve her ATM card from a truck that she shared with her boyfriend, Dwayne Tortolani, that was parked out front. While doing this, he was seen by Dwayne, who ran inside to get help, assuming that the man he saw climbing into his vehicle was just a thief. When he came back out with Samantha's father, Israel had already fled the scene. On his way home, Israel stopped by an ATM to confirm that the PIN number that Samantha had given him was correct, at which point he decided he no longer needed her. When he got back to the shed, he did disgusting things to Samantha before asphyxiating her, then left for a 2-week cruise with the body still locked in his shed. The cruise was likely just a way for him to be out of the area as the search for Koenig was underway, and it would also allow him to flee should he hear that he was suspected of the crime. After the cruise, he returned to Anchorage to carry out the second part of his plan, the ransom. Horrifyingly, he stitched Koenig's eyes open and posed her with a newspaper as if she was still alive and took photos to use with his ransom demand of $30,000. Keyes put the ransom note and photo in a park, then texted her boyfriend telling him where to find it. Over the next few days, he cut the body into pieces and dumped them down a hole that he had cut in the ice of Lake Matanuska. The community came together to help the Koenig family, contributing the money to pay for her safe return, unaware that she was already gone. Investigators also came together, prepared to find whoever had her ATM card by tracking any withdrawals. And indeed, they soon saw that withdrawals were being made, first in Anchorage, then Arizona, then New Mexico and Texas. The security camera footage from the banks showed that the man who was taking out the money drove a white Ford Focus. Near where a withdrawal had recently been made, Texas Highway Patrolman Corporal Brian Henry saw a vehicle matching the description in Lufkin, Texas. After Keyes was pulled over, the car was searched, and inside, investigators found Samantha's cell phone and wallet. They also found cash that had ink from a dye pack, meaning that it had likely come from a bank robbery. Israel Keyes was soon extradited back to Alaska, where he confessed to what he had done to Samantha Koenig. Over the course of months, he would describe some of the other homicides that he had committed over the prior years, though he toyed with investigators, refusing to give them specifics unless they agreed to his demands. The main thing that Keyes wanted was to avoid his daughter learning about what he had done by minimizing the publicity around the case. When his name did come up in the media, he stopped giving information, leaving many questions unanswered. The creature would say that the number of victims was less than a dozen, but gave very few details on their identities. On May 23rd, he attempted to escape custody by using wood shavings to pick the lock on his handcuffs and fleeing a courtroom during a hearing. Before he could take more than a few steps, a half-dozen U.S. Marshals and the court bailiff tased and tackled him. Months later, in July, he was discovered to be working on a different kind of escape. A noose was found in his cell, which resulted in Keyes being put under a close watch. However, as in other cases, this was not enough. On December 12th, as Correctional Officer Lauren Jacobson took a meal break, Israel Keyes retrieved the blade from a disposable razor and used it on his wrists, while also wrapping a blanket around his neck. Alongside his body, a series of writings was found, including a creepy poem-like portion that revels in what he had done to his victims, but which reveals no clues to their identities. It refers to his victims as captive butterflies, giving insight into how little he thought of them. Besides these writings, there was a series of paintings that he had done with his own blood. The paintings are a series of skulls, 11 in total, and a satanic image, who some have hypothesized symbolize Keyes himself. Beneath one of the skulls, the words "We are one" is scrawled, also in blood. As a result of this discovery and various hints made by the creature, investigators believe that he likely had a total of 11 victims. Who these men, women, and children were cannot be known for sure without the discovery of new evidence. However, the FBI and other investigators have come up with a list of possible names that may be connected. While living in Colville, Keyes had a boat which he would take out onto Lake Crescent, where he may have disposed of some of the bodies of his early victims. Such is the case of a girl named Julia Harris, a double amputee and Special Olympics gold medalist in skiing. She went missing on March 3, 1996, and only her prosthetic legs were ever found. Though Keyes was in the area at the time, the case is considered unsolved. Just over a year later, on June 27, 1997, a woman named Marlene Emerson was found burned in her trailer, and her daughter Cassandra's body would be found a year later several miles from where the trailer had been. Keyes would admit to authorities that one of his early criminal acts had been the arson of a trailer in Colville, which, along with his claim that 5 victims had been taken in Washington, make it very possible that this case is connected. The case of 48-year-old Deborah Feldman is an interesting one, as Keyes may have confessed to it unintentionally. Feldman was last seen on April 8, 2009 at her home in Hackensack, New Jersey. While her body was never recovered, Feldman's name was among those who Keyes searched for on a missing persons database. When confronted with a picture of her during his interrogation, he had simply said that he didn't want to talk about her yet. Keyes may not have even stopped taking lives even while he was on the move, withdrawing cash from Samantha Keyes' bank account. A 58-year-old man named James Tidwell went missing from Mount Enterprise, Texas on February 15, 2012. A few days later, there was a bank robbery which Keyes confessed to in Asley, Texas. During the robbery, Keyes had worn a white hard hat similar to what Tidwell wore at work, and had long dark hair, also similar to Tidwell's. When he had been asked about the hair, Keyes hinted that he had cut the hair from a human victim's head. There are many more potential victims connected to Israel Keyes, either by proximity, MO, or even his computer searches. But because he took the coward's way out and didn't even have the shred of decency that it would have taken to close the case on his other unsolved crimes, it is very unlikely that we will ever know for sure the names or even the total number of lives stolen by Israel Keyes.